Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Antonia Pais.
And today we are talking about the Enneagram and the Myers Briggs with our good friends and sometime collaborators, Antonia Dodge and Joel Mark Witt of Personality Hacker.
Super happy to have both of you, Antonia and Joel. Welcome to our Enneagram 2.0 podcast.
Thank you. We love being here.
Yeah, thanks.
We're really excited to talk about the Myers Briggs and the work you do and what you think of the Enneagram, what your experience of it has been, and some work that we're doing to work together on our common interest in using personality type systems to further growth and transformation. And also ways that we've started to talk about bringing the two systems together, building a bridge, if you will.
And I think that it's very timely to talk about the differences between the systems, what each of them do and what they don't do, the origins and, what's behind them. And just educate everybody about Myers Briggs, especially because, I had some prejudice against Myers Briggs. I'm just sharing this, and I said I had, Joel, because then I knew your work.
Then he met you, Joel, and it changed his whole life.
Yes,
I get that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is, you guys work with the Myers Briggs in a more developmental streak and
in a more developmental way.
Yeah. And that is really good news for me because I've seen in the past people using Myers Briggs in a very different way, and without much of an objective to allow people to grow. It was a bit more to label others. And I think that you guys bring in a deeper understanding of things like the cognitive functions that sometimes get lost in more shallow approaches of Myers-Briggs.
And the thing that you've really taught me is how exactly the Myers-Briggs functions as a growth tool. I think some of the ways that I had seen it used before were just very descriptive. Like you can't really do much with it other than note some differences between people. And so I love all the ways that you have articulated it and communicate about it and use it and apply it to really help people grow in much the same way that we do with the Enneagram. But before we get too much into that, I know that a lot of people listening that are maybe Enneagram 2.0 listeners may not know who you are or what you do. So can you tell us a little bit about Personality Hacker and how Personality Hacker evolved and how your work with the Myers-Briggs started and what you do?
So Antonia and I are a married couple. We are in a relationship together, and it's hard to talk about Personality Hacker without talking about the fact that we're in a relationship together because that actually happened first. The relationship happened before Personality Hacker really got to the place where it is today. And when we came together, Antonia had been working on developing some methodologies for using the Myers-Briggs to basically sit down and have a conversation with somebody and profile them and help them discover their best fit personality type. And I had been working a lot on marketing and communications and all the different things. And I'd loved personality systems, but I had never seen it in the depth that Antonia was working with it at the time we had met. And so when we got together, we're just in a relationship. She was doing her thing, I was doing my thing. And we started to see the ability for us to, as a couple, build something together that we could both be interested in, use our talents and skills. And so we got started. We ended up starting a podcast, and within a few months of starting it up, it became very popular. It's just a conversation between the two of us talking about growth and personality types and all the different systems and models that we use to grow in our own lives and bringing those to an audience. And that podcast started to grow and the business started to grow. And I guess that's where we find ourselves today, almost a decade later, having done this for a while together as a couple.
And the reason why the methodology I was working on when we met, and this is like way back when, right? We're talking, I mean, I guess it's not
Over a
been
decade.
over a decade, so it time flies, of course, but there was a time period on the internet, or the general relationship that people had with Myers-Briggs was sort of biased towards a business application. Most people thought,
Yeah.
when they thought Myers-Briggs, they thought business, or a test you took, or an assessment you took in college, or an assessment you took at your job. And and people had a very shallow relationship with it, because, when you're using it as an assessment for a job, it's actually more beneficial to the people giving you the assessment, for them to determine whether or not you're a fit or whatever. And of course, there was an attempt to make sure that there was an ethical relationship with it, in business, but that was primarily what people thought Myers Briggs was, or something fun, just like a fun test you take or assessment you take at the back of a popular book. And
Yeah.
there was this little subculture happening on the internet of people going back to the original roots of Myers Briggs, which is Carl Jung's work in cognitive functions. The very famously, the chapter 10 of his book, Psychological Types. And that was fundamentally the foundation of where the Myers Briggs assessment came from, the originators. And so, what had been sort of lost through time, this relationship with these cognitive functions, the backbone, really the spine of everything, that was starting to get a renewal, but it was still not something in the general, sort of consciousness and awareness around Myers Briggs. And so, because
It was hard to access
it
it,
was
really.
hard to access, and then because it was also a subculture, subcultures unconsciously, intentionally create gatekeepers, because they want to know whether or not you're in or out. And so, when you got into this sort of underbelly of Myers-Briggs cognitive functions, there wasn't any help. It was like, it was a wild west, and you just had to go figure it out yourself. And it actually has a fair amount of complexity written into it. So Joel and I, when we were developing things, one of the big questions we had is, how do we create the most accessible on ramp to go from this very shallow perspective of what Myers Briggs had become? Not that the people who had been, the stewards of the system themselves were shallow. I mean, there's decades of work in all of these various, sort of, circles, and Myers Briggs circles of amazing work that was sort of trapped in these subcultures, trapped in these like little small circles. And the question was, how do we create the most accessible on ramp so people can benefit from decades of work, and benefit from these deeper layers? And so Personality Hacker was effectively intended to be a tool. It was intended to be a cookie crumb trail to get from the shallow elements of Myers Briggs, that I took a test one time at my job, into the much more rich, complex, deeper layers where we believe the meat really was. And so it was an attempt to simplify. And that has been effectively what Personality Hacker's mission is to simplify things enough so that people can get the real benefit of those deeper layers.
Without losing the deep ability for it to change your life. Like, that's the
Right.
key, is to keep the fidelity, but simple access points.
Yeah, and I think that this explains, at least to me, why there's this magnetic pull between Personality Hacker and CP Enneagram Academy. I think it's clear that the two of you are seekers, both in psychology and spirituality, and also that you guys are really disappointed when you see shallow applications of Myers-Briggs, in the very same way that B and I are pissed off, actually, when we see, you know, approaches to the Enneagram that are very unfair to the depth of that system.
And I think another thing we have in common with you guys, something we really admire about you, and I think a lot of your fans really love about you, is the way you walk the talk, is the way you self disclose and talk about your own understanding of your own personality type, and how you're using Myers Briggs for your own growth and what you've discovered about yourself through the system. And so that's, I think, something that makes your work really special, in addition to just your level of depth of understanding and competence in the system and in communicating the system in accessible ways, as you're saying, building that on ramp. I love the way you put that.
Yeah, and talking about that, would you mind, guys, sharing with our listeners what your Enneagram types are and also your Myers Briggs types?
So in the Myers Briggs system, I have ENTP preferences, and in Enneagram, I am a sexual 3.
And for me in the Myers Briggs system, I have ENFP preferences, and I am a social 6 in the Enneagram system.
Very interesting. And there is a curiosity in here, right, B?
Yes, yes. It's very interesting because we are also a partnership that has an ENTP and an ENFP in it. And I'm happy to say that my Myers Briggs type, ENFP, has recently been validated by one of the biggest experts in the field, and that is Antonia Dodge, because I recently attended your profiler training in Florida in May, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I had the great pleasure and honor of having Antonia do a profile of me on stage in front of the group, ask me questions, do a formal interview where she assessed my type through her very deep knowledge and questioning of me to get there.
Yeah,
And
you got your official ENFP stamp on your forehead. Don't
Yay! I never have to doubt it again.
yes. So to me, everybody knows already by now, I guess, that B is a self-preservation 2 on the Enneagram, and I am a social 5. But I am the ENTP here in our partnership, and Antonia, who's a 3, and therefore a heart type, is the ENTP. So we're sort of similar on the Myers-Briggs, and perhaps not as much on the Enneagram. But then the head type, like I am, and Personality Hacker has the same type as the heart type here in our case, which is B.
I'm getting
Who's B?
confused already. So, so I think what you meant, I think what you're saying is you and Joel are both head types. Antonia and I are both heart types. However, you and Antonia have the same Myers-Briggs type, and Joel and I, interestingly, have the same Myers-Briggs type, even though he's a social 6 and I'm a self-preservation 2.
Thank you for translating me not only in English but also, in concepts. Does this happen with you guys also? Does Joel at times translate you, Antonia?
I actually think it might be the opposite.
Okay.
The plot thickens.
Well, I'm good at giving examples and practical applications, and she's good at refining the thoughts and getting real clear on the distinctions.
I was to piggyback on what you're saying. What's so interesting, and this actually what just happened might go back to the Ennea types. I don't know. You might be able to clarify this for me, but Arani and I are both thinkers in the Myers-Briggs system, which means that we're going to make decisions based on impersonal criteria and what makes sense to us, what's illogical to us as individuals. But Aranio, you are in your head type. And so that seems like that would be more conducive to somebody who is a thinker, whereas I'm a heart type, which is also very fascinating considering that I'm a thinker and explains a lot, by the way. When I ran into other people who were thinkers, but were very different than me, particularly socially and sort of whether or not they were tuning into other people and how they were. Sometimes there was a time period there where that was hard for me to suss out. Like, why did I feel different than other ENTPs or just thinkers in general? And then when I discovered I was a heart type, some of that cleared up. Whereas you, Beatrice, are a feeler and a heart type, whereas Joel is a feeler and a head type. And that also clears up some things. And so when you're looking at all of these dynamics, what's so fascinating is I think probably in the Enneagram as well, this must be the case. But in Myers-Briggs, we tend to have these archetypes in our heads, or sort of personal archetypes or stereotypes of how each of these personalities are going to show up and look. And what's so nice about mirroring these two systems is that you get a much more rich picture of an individual, because they're not just one thing, right? We're a cocktail of a bunch of different things. And so when you hear people give criticism, oh, personality typologies just put you in a box. It's like, well, I mean, in some ways we're all in a box, right? We all shove ourselves in there and shove everybody else in there. But when we start to get language for what these differences are and get language for some of these complexities and how they're intermingling, suddenly our distinctions make sense, and why I'm a thinker that tends to have a lot of problems that heart types have. That makes a lot of sense. Whereas those heart type problems are not necessarily something that is normally associated with the ENTP or a thinker style.
Mhm.
So I think that's why this marriage of these two systems is so nice, because sometimes we're trying to figure things out about ourselves that don't feel like they fit the stereotype. And once you get into this realm, you start realizing, well, I can start throwing some of those stereotypes away, and I can see myself as a unique individual that fits in some of, how I'm wired. It's more about how we're wired than it is about matching some sort of stereotype.
Yeah, this is super interesting and important in my view. And what you call a thinker on Myers Briggs is not the same thing as a mental type on the Enneagram. And many other concepts, even what Jung used to call intuition, is not the same thing that in the overall Enneagram field we call intuition. So, this is, in my view, one of the biggest mistakes behind previous and sometimes old pieces of work that tried to correlate Myers Briggs and the Enneagram. Personally, I would like to say very clearly, I have never seen any correlation between the Myers Briggs and the Enneagram that has convinced me in any way, shape, or form as being accurate. And I think that we'll get there at a certain point, but we're not yet there as a community.
But I want to clarify what I think you mean when you're saying correlation. And what I think you mean is a kind of one-to-one correlation,
Yes.
like ENTPs are this Enneagram type, or maybe these two Enneagram types. I think that's the kind of correlation that we've seen people try and usually aren't very convincing
Mhm.
when you really start seeing the depth of this. But I do agree, and I want to highlight one of the things that Antonia said, that part of what we see as our purpose in bringing these two systems together is to create more resources, more depth of understanding of the different nuances of how people operate. And of course, once you know how people operate, how they see the world, how they judge or perceive, then you can know a little bit more about how people can grow. It can be a
Mm.
kind of on ramp, as you say.
Exactly. And instead of getting distracted with too many descriptions of personalities only.
But before we say more, which we will, about building bridges between the two systems, or how we can think of the two systems together if there's not these clear one-to-one correlations, I want to find out more about you guys and how you came to the Enneagram, because one of the things I note about you is your company or your website isn't called Myers Briggs Hacker. It's called Personality Hacker. And so, one of the things I like about your approach is you're very open and wanting to use different forms of personality understandings to help people understand themselves at a deeper level. So, can you maybe say a little bit about how you came to the Enneagram, given that that you're Myers Briggs experts and that's your main thing, but that's not your only thing. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how you found the Enneagram and what you found valuable in it, or continue to find valuable in it?
I think that the first time I ran into the Enneagram, I mean, I think it's been quite some time. And I think I just saw something that was a quick description of the 9 types. And while it was interesting, it didn't capture me the way that Myers-Briggs had captured me, and I find that to be the case. I find the case to be like when you're introduced to 2 systems, one, for some reason, just has, like, a little bit more of a shimmer. I don't know what that is, but we just kinda get attracted to it. And I was like, "Oh, this is interesting," but I didn't, based on the materials I had read, I didn't have anything to grip onto. I didn't know what it meant beyond just the generic 9 descriptions. And so it was intellectually kind of interesting, but it wasn't something that really spoke to me. And then later on down the road, I got introduced to it again, and it was sort of a similar thing. I was like, I'm there's got to be something more here, but I wasn't really sure what it was. And then in the early days of Personality Hacker, where we were adding more systems and trying to find more models, because really, I mean, at the end of the day, we call ourselves system agnostic. we'll use whatever is the system that is the right tool for the job when it comes to growth and development. And in the very early days, I realized, well, this Enneagram thing has a pretty big following. A lot of people using it for growth. So I better figure out what this is. And so I started diving deeper and reading a lot of, books like the basics. I read Heddle and Palmer, and I read Riso Hudson, and I read, all of these different resources. And I started to kind of get a little bit more of an idea. Okay, I think I can hold, I think there's handles here. I think there are pegs to hang ideas on. This is not just generic 9 descriptions. And then it wasn't until we ran into your work, Beatrice, actually. I think I had heard you interviewed on a podcast. And the way you were talking about subtypes, and the way you discussed the system was the first time I really understood that there was something. It was almost like hearing about cognitive functions again for the first time. Does that make sense? Like, cognitive functions are that deeper layer. Most people just understand dichotomies, which are the EI, introvert, extrovert, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, perceiving, judging, and that's it, right? Like, that's what they know. And then you discover that there's a whole layer underneath of these mental processes, cognitive functions, that are really helping diagnose how our mind is wired to take in information and to make decisions. And it just blows the lid right off. And I felt like I had a similar experience with the Enneagram once I discovered subtypes. I think a piece of it too is that I had really struggled to find my type, because 3 seemed to be around what I was. It seemed like 3 was sort of in the ballpark, but I never felt like 3 descriptions were me dead on. And then when I heard a description of sexual 3, suddenly, because I think a lot of descriptions favor social 3s. That's sort of what I've been kind of picking up. And I'm actually social repressed. And so the social 3 description felt very not me, even though 3 felt me. If that, I was more of an energy. So when I heard the descriptions of the subtypes and really understood that idea of the instincts and the type being married together, suddenly it made sense. And suddenly I could really understand how it was a tool for growth. And so it was early days. It was like, I need to know this because this is the world I run in. And then at a certain moment, it was like, no, I need to know this because this is a powerful tool for my own growth and development. And so I think subtypes actually were the key to that, and your introduction of them.
Well, our strategy was to reach out to you, Beatrice. We're like, we started reading your book and heard you on the podcast. Like, let's reach out, let's connect with her.
Yeah.
And that was many years ago. And it's been
Yeah.
a great getting to know you.
We
And
started
Antonia now too.
we started twirling our mustaches and being like, how do we get in?
How do we
How do we
connect?
get Beatrice on our side? And yeah, it was pretty early. In the early days, we were doing a lot of finger steepling and trying to figure it out. And here we are. We figured it out.
Yes, yes, you guys are so funny. I'll never forget when you reached out to me and asked me to be on your podcast. And I looked you up. I was like, wow, these guys are really doing a lot. And I remember one of the things you said to me, which I took as a big compliment. You said, we read the complete Enneagram, and what we said to each other is, this is the book we would have written if we were Enneagram people. And so that was great. And so I loved being on your podcast. We had a lot of fun. And then I remember you got in touch with me a little while later, and you were so funny the way you did this. I don't know if you remember, but you basically used a kind of relationship metaphor for what you wanted next. You said, okay, I know we've just gone out on one date, but we kind of want to invite you over, to stay with us for a week. We realize this is going a little bit far, a little fast. Like, all of a sudden, we want to get much closer, and we've only been out once. We've only had the get to know you date, but we really want to go deeper, faster.
And then you traveled
And then
to meet them.
yes, and then you invited me to your house when we didn't really know each other to produce the Enneagram Roadmap, which is a long course that you guys have on your platform, that you produced, and that I did. And it was really fun to be with you for a full week and to do that program and to start to work together, kind of behind what we really, I think, have come to see as really a common mission. To really do everything we can to put tools out there for people to grow in the best ways possible.
And then we ended up coming to one of your retreats, and that was when we got to meet Aranio and see
Yes.
Aranio at work. And that's, I think, you said something, Aranio, at that event that has stuck with me. And I started to understand sort of the bigger application of the Enneagram is truly a spiritual tool. You said that uh, what was it? It was psychology without spirituality is incomplete, and spirituality without psychology is dangerous, and or something to that effect. I'm
Yeah.
paraphrasing, but
Hmm.
I realized that one of the things I really love about marrying these two tools together is I think that Myers Briggs definitely leans heavier on the psychological aspect. I mean, it was like a psychoanalytic tool originally to sort of understand these patterns of how people think. And it can be woven into a person's spiritual practice with growth and development, but it's not intrinsically spiritual in and of itself. Like there's
Hmm.
or if it is, we haven't, personally have not found that nucleus yet. It feels very much more like a psychological tool, but a powerful one if used correctly. And Carl Jung talked about a lot of concepts that are very much given to growth, like avoiding one-sidedness, and making sure that development is a major piece of it, and understanding all of the pitfalls of all of these different ways that a person can be wired and how to account for it. But again, it's not intrinsically spiritual. Whereas the Enneagram has such spiritual roots that it feels like the combination of these two things creates a complete picture. It's got
Yeah.
both of the psychological and the spiritual pieces tapped in, which is why they're complements to each other. I don't think they're overlapping. I don't think they occupy the same space. I think that they occupy two complementary spaces side by side.
I like what you say. It rings true to me.
Yes, and I want to say two things related to what you just said. One is, I think one sort of obvious difference between the Myers Briggs and the Enneagram is that Myers Briggs is very much based on these Jungian cognitive functions, which I've learned much more about in the last since I was at your training, and they're fascinating, and they're really important understandings about how our minds work. Now, the Enneagram is a system based on three centers of intelligence: the head, the heart, and the body. So, in a way, the Jungian cognitive functions are really only talking about the mental functioning, although, of course, when perceiving and judging, a lot of how that plays out is what you base decisions on, what you see out there when you're perceiving, and how you judge. But I also want to note that um, Carl Jung himself was extremely spiritual. In fact, that was one of the big ways that he differed from Freud, who he came right after, and who he had both admiration for and worked with and in concert with, but then also separated from to some degree. And one reason, I think, was that Jung was profoundly spiritual. There's a famous quote from a BBC interview with Jung where someone asked him, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "I don't believe, I know." And so I think, and he also talked about the collective unconscious, and I think that's something that Uranio and I get in touch with or explore or utilize when we do our inner work retreats and we do work that's more spiritual. And often I think of Jung's ideas as a way of clarifying what we see. But I'm getting a little bit far afield. Anything you want to say about any of that?
Well, I think that you just hit the nail on the head, which is Myers Briggs itself is almost an intellectualization of Jung's work that was deeply spiritual. And when I say I haven't found the spiritual nucleus of Myers Briggs, I think it's because you do have to tap into more of Jung's work itself. I mean, maybe I misspoke, because the truth is that the cognitive functions are in part a not a version of, but sort of built on top of some of the experiences Jung had when he went to India and studied chakras. And so, on some level, the cognitive functions are representative of some of the more spiritual aspects of chakras. And so there is a lot of psycho spiritual connection in Jung's work, tons, like you just mentioned. Myers Briggs itself is, particularly as it's applied, tends to take more of sort of a I don't know. It can be turned very antiseptic. It can be turned very sort of it has become something that an American audience can really really accept, and we have a tendency, in at least in this part of the West, to want things that are capable of only being intellectualized, because that's a lot less scary territory. And so the tools sort of reflect the culture, and the tool of Myers-Briggs reflects the intellectualization that Americans have a tendency to do as its birthplace. But Jung himself would not have used the tool in that way. And I think that that's something that surprises people, particularly, like, take, for example, people in the Enneagram community, which are people who are into the Enneagram are interested in the spiritual component, in the ego transcendent components, in the dealing with shadow work components. And it surprises them when there is that component in Myers-Briggs, because that's very rarely how it's introduced.
Yes, I do think the vast majority of the Enneagram audience or the Enneagram community is interested in or open to spiritual development, which is part of why they get attracted to the Enneagram. But I don't think 100% of the Enneagram community is. And I really agree with what you just said, that especially in the US culture, I think it's a secular culture to some degree, even though there's a lot of religion and spirituality there as well. And I like the way you put that. There is something appealing about systems that intellectualize our experience, because it makes it a little bit safer to enter into and less vulnerable. Now, I want to ask both of you um, a little bit about, if you can tell us a little bit about how you've used knowledge of both your Enneagram type and your Myers-Briggs type to grow. How have you used both of these things as a tool?
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, I can start with my personality type of Enneagram Social 6. That was a very big wake up call for me to see how the power dynamics in my own life, like how I had this weird relationship of giving away my power and then trying to take it back, and then giving it away and taking it back, and this frustrated experience through my life of what is going on? Why can I never feel okay in a lot of ways? I mean, that's a very general, I'm overgeneralizing or oversimplifying the complexities of what I have gone through once I've understood my Myers or my Enneagram type. But I think that was a big key for me, and which also correlates, interestingly enough, to very similar work that I had to do in the Myers-Briggs system. I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, and one of the things that we recommend to our clients and students and people we work with is that we grow a particular cognitive function in our personality, and that's the auxiliary function. And again, that's some technical stuff. We need to go into the details there. But basically, for me, my function that I needed to focus on was a function called introverted feeling. We've nicknamed it authenticity here in Personality Hacker, and it's a lot about this power dynamic of who is the authority in my life. Is it me? Is it an external force? Is it something that I should defer to, or should I take the power of my own life into my own hands and inside myself? And my religious upbringing kind of trained me out of that. So what was interesting so much is that not all ENFPs are Enneagram social sixes, and not all Enneagram social sixes are ENFPs, but the same work somehow for me emerged in both systems, which was beautiful. And I've seen this happen on a numerous occasions. People will, in both systems, be different configurations. It's not a pattern that you could do a one-to-one correlation, but often the work is similar for that person. And I think that was a really interesting thing of how much the two systems were complementary to my own personal growth in that way.
Yeah, I would say that the work of taking back, well, having permission to use how you feel as a gauge for the right decisions in your life, but also needing to be very zen.
Yes.
And as a social six, you had a lot of anxiety, and
Yeah.
that was part of it, was learning how to.
Well, and I intellectualized as a six, I'm intellectualizing everything. I'm bringing it through my head space first. And again, getting into my physical body and being more present and slowing down and getting in touch with my emotional core and what resonates with me as a core value or a motivation that speaks to me. Again, in both systems, that was something that I needed to do. And I think that was really powerful.
Mm. Yeah, and as an ENTP that is a sexual 3, my work in the Myers-Briggs system, according to the way my type's cognitive, it's technically called your cognitive function stack. And so it's an order of which of the 8 Jungian cognitive functions you're using in descending order. And I was inappropriately going to a cognitive function that wasn't as strong for me, but I felt I had to do it, which is a function called extroverted feeling or harmony, which is basically looking to others for approval and looking to others to help me know what I should be doing next, which is, again, not all ENTPs are threes and not all threes are ENTPs, but that also happened to be the exact work I needed to do as a sexual three, which is to stop looking to everybody else to tell me how to live my life, right? Like, to stop looking to everybody else to tell me what was the right course of action, to stop handing my identity over to others, and to find my identity back on my own footing. And so, I mean, again, as Joel mentioned, there's lots of layers in all of this, but it does seem to be that whatever work you need to do in the Enneagram oftentimes coincides with the same work you need to do in Myers Briggs and vice versa. And I don't know if the universe just makes that happen or we just find ways to understand how the same work is valuable in both systems. But I think each of the systems has given us different styles of language to pinpoint exactly what that work needs to
Oh
be.
yeah.
Like, it's like you get almost 50% of it with the Myers Briggs. It's like, I know I needed to do this thing, but that was more just sort of a theoretical cognitive understanding. When I realized what the specific style of inappropriate behavior was, like the inappropriate use of my handing power over to others and checking in and pinging other people all the time, and not having my own identity separate from what everybody else expected of me. When I had that specific language in Enneagram, suddenly everything just sort of coalesced and made much more sense. And so I was able to have more targeted growth, as opposed to sort of stabbing wildly or circling the drain. And I think that was the value for me.
Hi. If you're enjoying the depth of knowledge offered in this podcast, you might want to stay in touch with us. Witt and Antonia offer professional Enneagram training, personal development courses, self-guided online courses, and they even have a membership platform with over 100 hours of content. Head to cpenneagram.com/podcast to learn more.
That's great. And I just want to say something quick just to kind of compare you and me and Antonia, in that you are a three and you have extroverted intuition as part of your uh, Myers Briggs profile. And I also have that as an ENFP. And so I think we have that in common as a two and a three, that sense of kind of looking out there in the world and both being creative and wanting to connect and explore, as you said, but also then as a three you have T and I have F. And so there's a way, and again, I'm going to ask you to explain your car model in a moment, just so people will understand a little bit more about what this means. But it kind of makes sense because threes often aren't in touch with feelings sometimes as a first level experience, even though they're profoundly emotional deeper down. Often when they're in personality, their style is not so feeling oriented, whereas a two, myself, I am more feeling oriented. That's sort of the feelings are something that I'm accessing or referring to more when I'm processing what's going on around me.
Yeah. Um, just want to say also that although I'm a five, I relate to what Antonia said about looking outside at times. In my case, not as much for approval, but definitely for how I can make an impact on others. And that is not at all incompatible with the social subtype of fives that I many times think people don't understand well. There is a big need for social dominance at times, and certainly for social fives to be seen by others in high regard and as being knowledgeable and competent, and therefore we look outside to see what the standards are and how we can contribute, and even looking at other people and many times see how they are not doing a good work and position ourselves differently. Now, just coming back just a while to something we were talking about, I want to add a piece that I reflect a lot upon. It's a bit historical. Carl Jung died in 1961, Gurdjieff died in 49, so they lived at the same time and developed their works in parallel. And actually, I read and talked to some people also about how their paths were a bit parallel to each other in ways that are very interesting. The sources they were studying and even people they were getting in touch with, including spiritual masters and teachers. And I think that there is something about developing anything new, not only in inner work, that has to do with the collective unconscious. When it's time, different people who are capable start tapping into that thing that is becoming more mature from a collective stance. And then also, if you think of Oscar Ichazo as being the first person who developed what we now know as the 9 Enneatypes, I mean, he shared all that less than 10 years after Jung died, and he had been researching all of that all that way during Jung's time. So I think that although these systems tap into different things, they came from a time when there was an opening, especially the first half of the 20th century. There was an opening in studying the psyche in depth, and psychology itself was growing during the first half of the 20th century. And then from the second half of the 20th century, there was an opening to make all that public and to bring it to the West in special. So although the Enneagram is an ancient tool, we must say that it hasn't been open at all until Gurdjieff and Ichazo.
Right. It was rediscovered, or it surfaced, or it became public for the first time, something that had been uh, active in a secret way for many centuries. So I do think that's another commonality that I think is really interesting, that I'm glad you pointed out, between the time Jung was working and doing his groundbreaking work and the time Gurdjieff, who is one of the main sources of what we know about, especially about the Enneagram symbol as a process map, or as a map or a symbol of transformation. And of course, the work Oscar Ichazo did to bring forward, the seed of the modern, what we might call the modern Enneagram. Now, what I also want to ask Antonia and Joel, if you could say a little bit about what your what your unique take on the Myers Briggs has been. And I'm thinking here about your car model, to say a little bit more about how you have actually done what you said earlier you realized you wanted to do. How have you created this accessible on ramp into understanding the depth and richness that's available in the Myers Briggs in a way that hasn't always been obvious to people when they've just seen it as like the MBTI test on the mass market?
So the highest leverage point in understanding Myers-Briggs as a growth tool, not just a diagnostic tool of behavior, but really a diagnostic tool for how your mind is wired and sort of pre-wired to experience the world. These cognitive functions that we've mentioned multiple times, they're basically lenses through which we see all of reality. And it's like the whole, the blind men with the elephant. We're all touching a different part of the elephant, and we're overvaluing our experience on what that part of the elephant means, right? And our cognitive functions as individuals are part of it basically tells us what part of the elephant we're touching, right? And we're describing reality through. And so when you get to that level, then you can start to observe all of your biases. You can start to see why other people, when they disagree with you or they don't see what you're seeing, they're not being stupid or obtuse or deliberately obnoxious. They're just on the other side of the elephant, and they're seeing things that you're not seeing. So those cognitive functions are really high leverage tools for self-understanding, for interpersonal relationships, for figuring out, a growth path and diagnosing challenges when you have communication issues. Like, it's really it's the gold that lives under everything. But it's a little tough to wrap your head around because it's highly technical. There's tons of technical language that's a part of this. You've got 8 cognitive functions, and they're all, words like extroverted intuition and introverted sensing. And you have a dominant, auxiliary, a tertiary, and inferior. And then you've got shadow functions. I mean, it gets real technical real quick. And so we went, okay, so what's the easiest way to explain this to somebody? That you have 4 mental processes that are your primary lenses for experiencing reality. And these 4 lenses give you an opportunity to connect with the outer world, to get outer world feedback, and connect with your inner, the who you are inside. They also give you access, or they give you a way to take in information and understand it and perceive it. And they give you a best fit way to make decisions, and determine the value and worth of the information that you've been taking in. And it's really the combination of those things that determines a person's personality type. One of 16 personality types is all of these combinations. So we said, okay, and one of the reasons why it's confusing too is there's some crossover language, right? There's judging functions, but then there are also people who are judgers. Well, if you're a judger, does that mean you have a judging function? Well, everybody has a judging function, including perceivers. I mean, it gets, like I said, it's like a ball of yarn real quick that gets all messed up. So we went, okay, let's turn it into a really simple metaphor. And that's when we discovered the car model. The car model is a way of describing the 4 mental processes that people use that are going to have the biggest influence on them.
Now,
And so instead of
can I ask one question here?
yeah,
So
yeah,
so there are 8 cognitive functions, but these 4, kind of like the 4 at the top, right? So these 4 cognitive functions are the ones that each person has 4 that they use the most in order. Like there's one they use the very most, then a second, then a third, then a fourth. And of course it goes down to 8, but these 4 are kind of the 4 main ones that shape the way we perceive and judge the world. Is that right?
exactly. They're going to be the ones that have the most predictable influence on us, for better or worse. So knowing those 4 is the highest leverage. Like the other 4, those are called shadow functions, and understanding where they fit can be helpful, but it's not the leverage point, and it's certainly not something you want to data dump on somebody who's just entering this space. So just paring it down to those 4 is
Right.
sufficient, particularly when you're just starting to learn. And instead of calling them the technical names, which are dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior, which are all a mouthful, we just said, okay, imagine your mind is a 4-passenger vehicle. You have a driver. Sitting next to the driver is a co-pilot. Sitting behind the co-pilot is a 10-year-old, and behind the driver is a 3-year-old. And these all 4 of these characters in your car are the approximate relationship you're going to have with each of these functions. So there's going to be stronger functions up front, the driver and the co-pilot. And then they're going to be more childlike and unsophisticated or even immature parts of you, which are the 10-year-old and the 3-year-old. And knowing what those are can help diagnose all sorts of challenges. Why is everybody else seeing things that I'm not seeing? Or why am I seeing things that they're not seeing? And it's generally in part because of the positions that each of these 8 functions take for your particular car model. So again, it can be quite it's complicated in subject, but the breakdown, the metaphor makes it accessible. We also have nicknames for the 8 cognitive functions. So like you mentioned, you're an ENFP and I'm an ENTP. Actually, we're all ENPs on this call, which is crazy. But I mean, it's also kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So all of us share the same driver function. That would technically be the dominant of extroverted intuition. But we say it's your driver of exploration. And that makes it a little easier. So what is exploration? Exploration, and then you just kind of get this idea. What do explorers like to do? They like to go mess with things. They like to go explore areas that other people haven't explored before. They're mavericks. They like to enter new spaces and figure out new things and make connections other people haven't made before. And so it becomes a little easier to understand the relationship we have with these mental processes. But then our co-pilot is where we part ways. You and Joel, ENFPs, have a co-pilot of what's technically called introverted feeling, or as Joel mentioned, we call it authenticity. Whereas Aranio and I, as ENTPs, have a co-pilot or auxiliary of introverted thinking, or what we've nicknamed accuracy. So the 2 of you are going to make better decisions when you consult your feelings. How does something make you feel? What is how is it in alignment with you? Is it in alignment with all your values, with the things that mean something to you, on a sort of a really deep understanding of your intent and your motivation? Then that is the right decision. For Arani and I, we're going to be using introverted thinking or accuracy. So that's more about what makes logical sense to us. It's still values based, but it's values based on impersonal criteria as opposed to personal criteria, and what makes intellectual sense to us, what makes logical, what tracks with reason. And so we're all using the same driver, but the difference in that co-pilot makes a world of difference, and on down the line. So those are the kinds of things that we try to break down in a way where you can at least grip it, right? Wrap your head around it, and then leave a cookie crumb trail to the more technical aspects, to a place where once you're ready, once you get familiar with the language, because a lot of times it's just kind of like learning a new language. At first, all these syllables are just gibberish. Once you get to a place where the words mean something to you, now you can enter a more technical place and get real learning from it. Get a lot of the benefit from it. Is that what you were asking, by the way?
Yes, yes, that's
Okay.
really clear. That's exactly what I wanted you to clarify for our listeners who may not be as familiar with the Myers Briggs as they are with the Enneagram. But I think that's a great opening to just show people how both complex this is, but also very rich. Because one of the things you taught me is that, say, ENFP isn't just like a type that has like a list of characteristics and that's the end of it. That's not it at all. I like what you say about these 4-letter types in the Myers Briggs. They're like a decoder ring to help you understand what your main cognitive functions are and how they operate and how that informs how you process and information relate to the world.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is an assumption I'm making in people in the type world. But there's a distinction. If you're brand new to Myers Briggs and you see these 4 letters like ENFP or ENTP, the cognitive functions are not necessarily represented in those 4 letters. Those are giving you a binary or a dichotomous understanding of something like introversion and extroversion. That's what the E or the I stands for. In intuition and sensing is the 2nd letter. Thinking and feeling are the 3rd, and judging and perceiving are the 4th. And by the way, there is meat there too. There's like information you can get, and that's been primarily the tool used in business applications, are those 4 letters. And you can just squeeze that lemon and get a bunch of juice out of it. But there's a limitation to what it can help you with when it comes to development and personality development. And so those 4 letters are the decoder ring for what your cognitive function sequence is underneath it. And those are slightly different than the dichotomies. So it's important to remember that what most people are familiar with and why they balk at it oftentimes, that just puts people in boxes, etc., is because of other people's use of the application or application of the tool, not the tool itself. Those 4 letters tell you what your cognitive functions are underneath, which is it's a rabbit's hole, right? Like once you enter that space, it just keeps going, right? And I mean, we've been doing this for over a decade and it just keeps going. So it is good to create a distinction between those two worlds. And the cognitive functions, are a world that not everybody taps into. And that's the power of the system.
Right. And one of the things I learned when I attended your training was that some of these cognitive functions sound a whole lot like specific Enneagram types. Now, that doesn't mean that every Enneagram type has this cognitive function as their driver or their co pilot. But it does, for me, I started to see, oh, I think there may be a way that we can put this very fascinating and complex puzzle together of what are the relationships between that Myers-Briggs, as you study it, the cognitive functions, the polarities, all these different elements that are quite complex. But when you start to understand them, you learn a lot about how you operate in the world and the Enneagram. For instance, I think I told you guys extroverted feeling, for instance, that's one of the functions, sounds a lot like what 9s and 2s do. Right now, it doesn't mean all 9s or 2s have that, but there may be that may be kind of a connection to be followed up on and explored. I have introverted feeling as a 2, but I have extroverted intuition, and so again, I started to see how some of these cognitive functions can potentially be related to certain types. But then again, it's almost like a mosaic because it's about how these different pieces fit together, these different polarities: extroversion, introversion, intuition, sensing, uh, feeling and thinking and perceiving and judging, how the different pieces fit together and how those pieces can also be related to things that the Enneagram types do when they are out there in the world perceiving and processing information and experiencing life.
Very interesting. You know, as someone who has a second function of introvertedly thinking, I've been taking notes during our talks about possible new theories that explain that using the Enneagram arrows and wings, even because these are four as well as the functions are, the main functions are four. And then B handed me a pen because I was taking notes on my cell phone introvertedly, and I didn't really want to share any theory for now. So just to give you a
That's
picture of what's
okay.
happening.
That's okay. But I do want to, I want to say this as a window into, I think, what further work we're interested in doing together as time goes on. But can you tell us a little bit more about what your attraction to the Enneagram has been, and, you know, some of the things, the projects that we've, the four of us have been working on together, and how you
Yes.
see that as part of your larger project?
I think so I'll just make a general statement. I think there's a rush and an anxiety in the personality world, the communities at large, to try to find an elegant one size fits all will finally determine the crossover between Myers Briggs and Enneagram once and for all, and we'll make that correlation. I think the four of us, we've talked about it many times, that the likelihood of that happening is probably, I mean, maybe it's possible, but the probability of it happening anytime soon is less, because I think that removes some of the power of what it can do, because it's almost like you're taking a toolbox with you to do a job in your life. Like you're coming and you're showing up and you want to apply and grow in your life, and you're going to pull different tools at different times of your life and different growth strategies, right? And sometimes they cross over, and sometimes you're doing work, in both systems at the same time. But the trying to make the diagnostic part so perfect and so crossed over just elegantly, I think is the wrong approach from my experience.
Yeah.
I think the approach that we like to encourage people, and we like to do ourselves, is when you get to the moment of decision or growth, that's when you look at the Enneagram and you bring the tool in. And that's when you look at Myers-Briggs, you bring the tool in for the application moment, the action moment, when you're doing something, you're growing, you're doing it. And all the descriptions and things are great. They're nice to try to find all the crossovers, but that's the key. And that's, I think, the message that I believe all four of us want to bring people back to, is that's when that becomes really powerful. And I think the attraction to the Enneagram is it can help people access parts of the ego, parts of the self that the Myers-Briggs system has. Maybe it's more complex to get to, or it sees a whole different avenue. Myers-Briggs is looking more at the cognition, whereas Enneagram is looking more at like your fixations and things of this nature. So that's what we've seen in this. And I think the Enneagram, also that psycho-spiritual thing that Antonia mentioned earlier, is such an appeal. And you guys really woke us up to that when we came to your workshop, how much is there. And in fact, you were inspiring to us to say, we need to bring more of those psycho-spiritual elements into the Myers-Briggs system and help people find access points for that too. Because I think that the big themes I see in both systems are ego and ego management. Like, and what's weird in this world is our egos are all like colliding together, not the four of us, although that might also happen. But like, people's egos are very viscerally to the front when we're talking about our personalities, our identity, our egos, all this stuff comes forward. And I think that it shows me a way that I can go, okay, this is my ego showing up here. This is a way I can manage it using the Myers-Briggs system, or this is my ego showing up here. This is a way I can manage it, or move beyond it, or work with it in the Enneagram system. And I've seen that, I've seen the power in that, I guess. And I think Antonia probably has some things too to say about it.
Well, what you mentioned, the rush to make some sort of elegant system as quickly as possible. I mean, Beatrice, you recorded a podcast with us, and we talked about this idea of collaboration and trying to figure out where's the center of the Venn diagram on these two systems. And we had somebody make a comment on our podcast that was like, well, this research has already been done on this. This is already done, almost like it was complete, and, and there was like a nail in the coffin or something. And, you mentioned earlier, Oranio, that you've never seen one of those that has satisfied you. And I would say that most of those, the correlation diagrams or whatever, it's almost always somebody who is more well versed in one of those systems or the other.
Yeah,
And what they tend to do is they see the complexity in their system of choice, and then they oversimplify the other system.
exactly.
Oh, good
And
point.
and so because of that, because they don't have like a full complete understanding of both systems equally, it makes it easy to sort of shoehorn things in with each other. Whereas I think the reason why what is exciting about what we're doing is that we fully recognize that we are not Enneagram experts, right? We know that about ourselves. And so we're seeking people who are, because we don't want to just slapdash it like, oh, Enneagram's super easy, and then just shove them in together. Like we know how much complexity is actually woven into Myers Briggs, and we know that the Enneagram is the same. And
Yeah.
so, you start throwing in subtypes, and you start throwing in cognitive functions and polarities, and you start throwing in, like all of these things that you often talk about having alchemical responses, right? It changes the game. We want to be slow
And
about
respectful.
and respectful of each of these systems and the complexities. And I think that's why the beginning is to focus on the application of growth, and not rush to, get so rushed about having to create this perfect model, this perfect elegant model, because that's more about us, right? Like, we came up with it, and we don't need to come up with anything. But if we see things that are powerfully emergent, then we definitely want to keep kicking that ball forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up, Antonia, and to explain all this. I agree with you fully, although I think that at times some of the attempts have been done, were done by people who don't understand the complexity of either of the systems. Because some Enneagram people who try to do it, I mean, how can we get to anything correct if these people don't understand something like the subtypes? It's impossible. It's completely impossible. And unfortunately, I think that some people were way off. And I'm just giving my personal opinion here. Now, if and then complexity times complexity equals long term whatever, and it takes time. And then I think Joe brought up a very good point. Why would we focus on this if our job is helping people grow? So my question to you guys is, what do you believe are the best things that each of the two systems can help people with when they are willing to grow?
Hmm. So the metaphor in my mind, and I don't think this is a perfect metaphor, but it's just a way for me to understand it, is I think of your Jungian functions, your Myers-Briggs type, as being like your operating system. Like, each of these functions is very neutral. It can go either way. It can be good or bad. They're just descriptions of how a person's cognition is wired. And what they do with it is, of course, is very important. So it's almost like the operating system that everything else gets written on top of. And then I think of the Enneagram types and all the various components of it as being the software programs that get written on top. These are narratives and stories about how reality works and our place in reality. And so I think that when a person is using these systems for growth, I think understanding the baseline operating system is really powerful, because you're going to understand why there are certain things you're attracted to or not attracted to. You're going to see, there are some applications written for, Apple, that are not available for uh, Android, right? And but if you keep trying to use an Android application, so you're just going to get frustrated. So kind of understanding what you're working with at the baseline is very important. But there's not a lot of hierarchy in it. There is mastering your tools. There is understanding a way to avoid one-sidedness. There's a way of recognizing why you might be out of touch with some components that are very important. Like, take, for example, I'm an intuitive driver. which means that my sensing element is going to be it's going to be much lower on the stack. And that means my relationship to my body is going to be quite disconnected. I'm going to have a tendency to intellectualize things. If I do that too much, I get too one-sided. And so Myers-Briggs helps remind me that I need to get in touch with my body. I need to get in touch with more of a sensing, grounded place. And it's going to be a struggle. And the struggle doesn't mean I'm doing something wrong. The struggle means that I'm doing something that is a balancing act. Versus other functions that when I'm doing them, they feel wrong too, but they feel wrong because they are wrong, right? They are not the right tool for me. So it helps me understand why something I might be out of a comfort. Is this a good out of my comfort zone, or is this just not a leveraged out of my comfort zone? So understanding what we're working with at a baseline is really helpful. And then on top of that, as more of a vertical model, Enneagram can be more of a vertical model of growth. It helps us understand where we're at in our stream of health and where we're at in our stream of a relationship to our ego. And that might be complicated if we're using the wrong tools. Like we're trying to address our Enneagram type. I'm trying to address my 3. I'm trying to make it so that I'm not handing my power over to everybody else and trying to figure out what everybody else wants from me and doing my little dog and pony show all the time. But if I used tools that were better for somebody else's operating system, it might just be a constant frustration. I'm trying to do it, but for some reason it's not landing. I'm following this person's advice, but for some reason it's just not working for me. And so I might be spinning my wheels, even though I'm doing the work sincerely. I'm still spinning my wheels. There might be more leveraged work I could be focused on. And so understanding that operating system, make sure that we're choosing the right tools, and then understanding the vertical development of my relationship with my ego and the spiritual transcendence component helps me know where to apply those tools. And I think that's the relationship that I've created with both of these systems, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that that may be, and I'm really excited to think more about this and how the two systems can fit together, especially from the point of view of growth and development. But what I was thinking as you were talking is, if we take you as an example, saying you need to get more in touch with your body. I mean, on the one hand, the work for some 3s is getting more in touch with feelings, and feelings are sometimes accessed more by getting in touch with the body. So that's just kind of a basic thing a 3 could work on. So it's sort of like a potential thing on the list that 3s can learn from the Enneagram in order to grow. Another aspect from the Enneagram that could be applied in what you're saying is the arrow line movements. Now, we teach that the 3 first needs to integrate the healthy qualities of type 6. And that, in a way, sometimes it's good to go to something that's a little bit easier as a go-to. And as a thinker, as someone who is very intellectual and goes to logical and rational data, it's like accessing 6 and developing the healthy qualities of 6 could be a great first step for you, which allows you then to move to 9, which could be the place where you get more into your body. And it could be an easier access point once you've done that work at 6, which is what we talk about when we talk about the arrow line movement. So I think what we're kind of going to be hopefully building out here is kind of how these two different systems that have very clear differentials can also create a really sort of complete or holistic map of different ways of furthering your growth, depending on what Myers-Briggs type you are, what Enneagram type you are, where you are in your life's journey, what your history has been, all these different elements that make us complex, that can help, that where we can almost see the complexity of both systems and the way they can be brought together as kind of fitting for the fact that we are complex individuals and there are a lot of moving parts to our experience and different things to understand.
I like the word map, and that's effectively, because that's what we're doing, right? I mean, that's why we always say things like the map is not the territory. Like our personality type is not us,
Yeah.
but it helps give us coordinates and a little bit of a topographical view of some elements of ourselves that are good to know, right? It's never going to be a complete map. But when you start to put these maps together, then just like on a mall map with a you are here dot and then the place you want to go, what's nice about this is that it can create sort of a you are here dot map. It's like, okay, now I know what coordinates I'm starting out with. I know my starting point. I know where I want to go. And based on the layout of what I'm working with, here's the best way to get there. And I think I think you can do all the work we're talking about, you can do without these maps. Like psychospiritual work can be done without personality typology systems, right? Like it's available to everybody. But one of the reasons why we get so fascinated by these things is number one, of course, we get more, it's about us and we're super fascinated by ourselves. But I think the other thing is we realize how much easier it makes everything. It gives us language for stuff that we wouldn't otherwise have language. It's so much more efficient. It creates direct lines, whereas we might have zigzagged and just done these switchbacks for eternity. It's like we just have so much more of a frame of reference for what we're working with, that I think the combination of these two systems. I do. Can I make a cautionary statement though, just
Please.
really quick?
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that we've noticed, and you could almost call it a form of spiritual bypassing, is people get so fascinated by the models that they forget that if you're going to talk about type, you need to be talking about development. That's really they cannot be separated.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when people get super 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 into systems, they lose the thread of why they started in the first place, or the application and the practical
Mm.
piece. So when a person is already super into a system and they get introduced to another system, like, wow, a whole new system to go explore. It's almost better if that one system that you've been consuming a lot of content around and feel like you've got a pretty good grasp of, if you're in a time period of application, applying those things to better your life, stay with that thing, right? Do the work of that system, prescribes for you before you jump into another system and then go back to the beginning and then get all fascinated by a system and don't do the work. It's almost better to have less information and be practically applying it than get caught in the massive amounts of data. But if you are a person who naturally learns through application, which I would recommend all people do because real learning equals behavior change, but if you're a person who, as you learn this content, you are applying it and using it to, to progress in your spiritual work, your transcendence work, your achievement work, or healing work, or whatever it is you're focused on. Um, if you are capable of weaving another component in without it being a distraction, then it can be so helpful. But if you're the kind of person who tends to get really obsessed with systems and loses the thread of why, then it might be better to stick with that one system until you feel like you've got a good grasp of that work before moving on to the next one.
I absolutely love that. And this is a little bit of what we try to do in our Enneagram starter kits with you guys, because they are, we didn't want that to be a distraction.
Yeah, what I
Mhm.
wanted to say is, building on what you're saying, Antonia, is some people, like we've talked about before, get stuck at the level of description. Like, I'm going to endlessly describe what my personality is like, and oh, another system to describe it. This is my cognitive function. This is my stack. This is my Enneagram type. This is my subtype. This is my instinctual sequence. But they don't apply it, as you're saying, as you're emphasizing. They don't apply it for real growth. They don't take it and go deeper into themselves and say, because you need to answer the so what question. And if you just are on, and we see this sometimes in social media where people are just endlessly describing, but not applying and not using and not getting anywhere. So speaking of that, as Ranio just said, we want to ask you to talk a little bit about the Enneagram starter kits that the four of us are collaborating on, and that will live on the Personality Hacker website. And this was your brainchild, so can you tell us a little bit about why the Enneagram starter kit and what they're going to provide for people?
For many years, we've had a starter kit for each of the Myers Briggs personality types. So all 16 types, there's 16 different starter kits. And basically, this is designed to take you from not knowing anything from your type. You could take an assessment. You could take an assessment on our website or somewhere else. It doesn't really matter how you arrive at what your best fit type is. But the starter kits are designed to go, okay, you are an INTJ as an example. And now what do you do with this information? Here, let's explain a little more how you're wired, how you learn information, how you make decisions, but also what are some growth avenues for you? What are some other things INTJs struggle with? What are the things that they have, challenges of in their life, personal challenges with other people, or even their own personal life? And we're going to talk about some of the ways, some of the principles and ways you can grow and develop yourself now that you know what your Myers Briggs type is. And so we're talking with you and Aranio, Beatrice, and we've done, some collaboration of just some one-off events. We've obviously done the Enneagram roadmap with you, Beatrice. And then we were talking and saying, wow, it would be really great to have a starting place for people, almost a primer for each of the 9 Enneagram types, and then go into the subtypes as well. Why don't we create something together jointly, and let's develop 9 of these starter kits that can get people orientated to their type early on, especially when they're starting out, to know a little bit more about what that type means, maybe discover a little bit more in depth around their subtype, which is extremely helpful as far as, Antonia and myself have experienced in our own lives. And of course, you guys teach it, so you know the power of it. And we thought this is a great avenue for people to get attuned to that, to get a primer, to get orientated, and then see some of the initial ways they can begin to work on themselves and grow. And so we've actually done all the recording together. We've gotten this together, and we're bringing this out into the world now. And we're really excited about it. We think it's going to be a great touch point for people. That's going to be a good on ramp for more deeper learning. The workshop we went with, the live workshop we went to with you guys, it was pretty deep. It was pretty intense and deep. And we were ready for it because we'd worked with you before to understand ourselves and some of the basics. And I think that's what's available to people when they really get a sense of where they're starting from. We call these starter kits almost like the "you are here" dot in your life, right? This is the starting place. This is the "you are here" dot on the map. And now we're going to show you a whole big territory. Now that you know what your Enneagram type is, where you can go from here, what you can do with this. This is powerful stuff. Let's start to create a way that we can take what you know about yourself now and grow.
Right.
So
And
that's the intent behind it.
that's really well said. And I know that you have these starter kits for the Myers Briggs types as well. So if people have gotten really interested in all that you're doing now and everything we've talked about, can you tell people how they can find you and what you have available right now if people want to learn more?
Sure. So, like we said, the starter kits are great. They're literally called starter kits because they're great places to start. And we've kind of played with the name a little bit because we're always like, well, if somebody knows type, are they going to want to? Because there's a lot of good stuff in here, even if you're a little bit more advanced in your understanding. But we do call them starter kits just to make them accessible. Personalityhacker.com is our website. It's probably the greatest place to start because we've got articles. We have our podcast release, which is probably the other thing that I would highlight. It's a free podcast release once a week. We've been doing it for over 8 years now, I think, and we're so excited to share with people. We just have conversations around type and how to grow and how to apply things. So that's a great way to get to know us better and learn kind of our approach to this. But a starter kit would be great for your type. So if you want to take an assessment on our website, or if you already know your personality type in the Myers-Briggs system, you can just go to our website and our course catalog. We've got other courses that are a little more advanced, for growing specific types and specific topics like career, business, relationships, all of these things. And that's all at personalityhacker.com.
Fantastic. Guys, thank you so much. We haven't finished yet because we're going to do a very special top 5 with you.
Cool.
So hang in there.
But thank you so much. We love working with you. We love talking with you. We could probably this podcast could probably be about 3 hours long.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to discuss all things personality, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs with you.
And the two of you are delightful.
Yes. And we so appreciate how you really are role models for how to do the work that you're talking about and teaching others to do.
And thank you both for spending the years, decades of learning about the Enneagram. We, Antonia and myself, personally, and this is a personal gratitude thank you to both of you, we have personally benefited from the decades of study and work separately, and then together. You've worked together. You have changed our lives in a lot of ways, and we just want to be grateful towards you and say thank you so much. I don't even know, I'm guessing the person listening right now understands how much value sits right here with Beatrice and Aranio, but I just want to reiterate, you're in good hands as you listen, and keep listening. Stay attuned to these guys, because they get into some things that have really altered our lives and lifestyles.
Yeah, I want to echo that for sure.
It's time for our top 5.
What is our top 5 today, B?
Today we have a very special top 5, and it's because Joel and Antonia, our special guests, are going to say the top 5 differences they think are important to know about the Enneagram and the Myers Briggs. So, differentiators, distinctions, the top 5 things that make the two systems different from one another.
Yeah, so I guess this will help us wrap up many things that we said during the podcast, as well as bringing up more awareness for everybody about what each of the two systems can do better.
So, Joel, what is your number 5 difference between the two systems?
Math. Math is my number 5 because
Interesting.
You've got a system on the Enneagram side that's divisible by the number 3 because there's 9 types. And on the Myers Briggs side, it's divisible by 4 because you have 16 different types. And so there's a little bit of a math difference in the, syncing these two systems up. I've noticed that as one of the biggest challenges in even finding correlations. It's just basic math.
That's a great one.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Head Type. So, Antonia, what is your number 5?
Does this happen often? It's the exact same one.
Are you serious?
Wow,
Yeah.
it actually does happen often.
Yeah.
It
I
does.
like hid my paper from you because I didn't want you to cheat.
I know. He was writing something down during the podcast, and I looked over, and he just he got real protective of it. And I was like, "Oh, that's one of the 5." Yeah, no, my number 5 is factor of 3 versus factor of 4. That there's different numbers represented in it, which is one of the reasons why a direct 1-to-1 correlation with these two systems doesn't really work. There's not a 1-to-1. It's totally different math. Yep.
Very nice. Yeah. Sometimes B and I agree also.
Yeah. Sometimes we're totally different. Sometimes we agree. Yeah. So what's your number 4, Joel?
Yeah. So the number 4 is the difference between, and this is a little more, I don't know how tangible it is, but it's more of how I perceive the systems. In the Myers-Briggs system, I see it very, very much as an articulated system. We use words and language. There's literal letters that express the types, like ENFP. And so it's a very linguistic, language-focused, letter-focused system. And on the Enneagram side, I've noticed it's very symbol and number focused. So it's very symbolic. There's a lot of symbology, which isn't as much in the Myers-Briggs system. And there's numbers. And so you kind of have a number symbol system versus a language articulated system, in my mind, how I see the differences.
That's a good one.
Interesting.
That's a really good one. Mm-hmm.
What about you, Antonia?
I went back to my metaphor of an operating system versus an app. The Myers-Briggs seems to be more of an operating system. It's sort of a neutral, this is the baseline of the kinds of things that your mind is wired to focus on and look at and be attracted to and look, and it's always screening for things that are compatible with it. Whereas Enneagram is more of the narratives that are overlaid on top of it, more like application based, more there's a lot more things around things that are like good and bad or desirable or not desirable. And so it tends to be more narrative based. So
different kinds of patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving that kind of are layered on top of the wired in ways of functioning.
Yep.
Great. Great.
Number 3. What is your number 3, Antonia? Let's go with Antonia first now.
Ooh. So my number 3 is that in some ways, Myers-Briggs is more accessible, whereas Enneagram tends to attract people, it seems like at a certain point in their path. Enneagram, you have to be a little bit more open to the things that Joel was talking about, like the symbology and things that are a little bit more high-minded. Whereas Myers-Briggs, I mean, that's one of the reasons why Myers-Briggs became such a business application, because it's something that at its most simple parts are things that people can really access. Right. So I've got Myers-Briggs tends to be more accessible, and Enneagram tends to be something that you have to be almost ready for.
Right. The Enneagram looks a little bit more like a devil symbol. Like, what is that thing?
That's right. It totally does, doesn't it?
Whereas Myers-Briggs is acceptable in the business community and has research behind it and is a little bit more, like you said, kind of acceptable.
Although nowadays it seems that the Enneagram is being more and more used as a sequence for businesses that have been using Myers-Briggs for some time.
Yes, definitely. Enneagram is expanding in use in business like never before.
Yeah. Now you guys are gonna feel what it's like to have your system be all like chopped up. So as the money makers can,
Oh
yeah. I mean,
my.
it's probably a good thing. It's probably a good thing, but whenever it gets in the hands of the masses, all of a sudden you're like, no,
Yeah.
there's so much more.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll be paying attention to that for sure.
Mm.
But Joel, what is your third?
Yeah, so third for me is I've noticed the difference in kind of how these systems emerge and then what that means. So for the Enneagram, it feels like it was a system that was discovered or rediscovered, an ancient system that was rediscovered, which really leads to various schools of thought. Because as we're discovering it, as all of us discover this Enneagram, obviously we stand on the shoulders of giants of people that have discovered it beforehand and have brought us wisdom and understanding. But there's not been this cohesive storyline with everyone on the same page. There's a lot of different schools of thought that have emerged, I think, because it's so discovered. And that's a very ancient wisdom. It's kind of passed down to us. Whereas the Myers Briggs system was constructed, it was built, it was designed.
Like invented, like
Invented, and
discovered.
it was it was more of a modernist. In the mid-century of the last century, in the 20th century. And it came about in that kind of way. And so it's a little bit more, there's not as many schools of thought. There are schools of thought and way people apply it, but the system itself, there's a lot more agreement on how it looks and how it functions, because I think it's more recent and it was built rather than being discovered. So I've noticed those are it's more standardized and things of this nature. So those are the two big differences in how the system shows up.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, another good one. What about you, Antonia?
Oh,
Number
I did my
two.
number 3.
That's right. What
Yeah.
about number 2 for you?
So for number 2, it's I go back to what I mentioned before, that Myers Briggs seems to be more of a horizontal model. It seems to be that, I mean, and to some extent Enneagram is too, where it's like we're all different, but to some extent we're like, we're all kind of equal, but distinctive. Whereas I think that Enneagram takes advantage of a vertical component more than Myers Briggs generally does, which is that, yeah, we're all different. We're all dealing with our stuff, but also there is a definitive path of growth. Like you can be a much healthier version of your type. And so there's a vertical element of it, not of dominance or hierarchy, but more of like a self assessment. I think Myers Briggs has that too, but I don't think that element has been as tapped into. I think that was its original intent, was to be aware of those things and to use it as a growth model, but it hasn't been for a long time. So I think Enneagram has done a better job of weaving that into an introduction of the model itself. And I think Myers Briggs is that's something that's burgeoning on the cognitive function side.
Yeah.
Very clear.
And so the number 2 for me is when I was tuned on to each system, how I experienced or felt about it. So I'm introduced to Myers Briggs. Oh, this is cool. I'm an ENFP. I like this about myself. This is awesome. I like all the things this describes about me. This is cool. This explains so much. I like it. I like it. I like it. And then I get to the Enneagram. It's like, oh, you're a social 6, and here's all the stuff you got to deal with. And this is the tough. And I'm like, oh, I don't like this as much. This is like hard to hear about myself. Like, oh, I mean, there's some cool stuff in there, but man, look at all this stuff that I do wrong or bad. I mean, this is how I interpret it the early days. Like, oh man, I've got so much stuff I've got to overcome. And so that was a big difference for me, is just the way that I liked the Myers Briggs when I first kind of heard about myself, but I was like, oh, I don't know if I like this Enneagram stuff. It's kind of pointing out the stuff that I'm not sure I'm cool with. I don't know. So that was, and now I love the Enneagram system, but that first rush was just, whew, it was hard to hear.
Yeah, there's a phrase that we talk about called type patriotism in Myers Briggs, which is why when you think that your type is the coolest. And everybody should have a little bit of type patriotism in Myers Briggs because you want to accept yourself. But I don't think there's much type patriotism in Enneagram.
Yeah, the ick factor is bigger. It doesn't, the bad news is a little bit more upfront. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think we're at number 1, right?
Yeah.
So,
you wanna go first, Antonia?
Yeah. Why don't you go first, Joel?
Joel,
Is that okay?
why don't you tell us what your number 1 is?
Yeah. So the number 1 for me is the ego involvement. So I personally see the Enneagram as more of a Eastern way of dealing with the ego, which is to overcome it, right? The Eastern school of thought, which is to overcome the ego and work with the ways that my ego is kind of flaring up in a challenging frame for me. And on the Myers Briggs side, it's more of the Western mindset. It's more of ego boosting. It's more, rather than overcoming, it's more, how can I be more of what I already am in a lot of ways, growing my ego development and not making myself egomaniacal, but definitely supporting and augmenting. So it's a very different kind of approach to my ego. One is really working and to overcome. And I think the other one is to balance out the one-sidedness and to optimize how I show up ego-wise. And in those ways, it really helps me approach the ego from both directions, right? Both the overcoming and the augmenting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. My number one is basically the same thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I've got Enneagram is a more spiritual ego transcendence tool, and Myers Briggs is a more psychological self acceptance tool.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, and so that's the same deal. And I think that they're very complementary, because I think I think you need to have both. Like, not everybody's ready for ego transcendence. If they haven't accepted themselves, then ego transcendence is probably just going to be a form of bypassing.
Yeah.
And so, if you need to diagnose where you're at in your ego development, using these two tools helps diagnose, and lean on the tool that's the more appropriate for the moment where you're at in your timeline. And so they're for slightly different applications, but yeah, same one.
Oh, that excellent top
Yeah.
5.
You guys are very aligned. I'm almost worried that he and I will need to catch up to that in our next top 5s.
And this was also a really good summary, I think, of sort of the differences between these two systems. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you, guys. This was wonderful.
Yeah, no, thank you.
And thank you for listening. Join us again next time for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.